Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. Today, we're going to be addressing something very interesting. It's going to be a special episode featuring the 40K universe. I've had a lot of questions regarding this, and that question is the Imperium a man of 40K, that is Warhammer 40,000, fascist? Roll the intro, and we'll get into it. Okay, it's good to see everybody, and I always forget to fix that. All right, cool. It's good to see everybody. I hope you're all doing well. And what we're going to be doing today... Yes, I love that intro, too. It's actually going to get an update here soon. But anyway, we're going to move this off to the side real quick. I'm going to largely focus on this. Chat, make sure you don't get outside of hand. All right, cool. Let's hit this. So this is a special episode. The last thing that you guys probably saw on the upload list yesterday was a intro into 40K, what it is, what it means. And there's a lot of that I didn't cover in that particular intro episode, but I've had so many people ask me because, hey, Tiberius, you study in economics and political science. There's a big conversation on the online community. Is the Imperium of 40K fascist? Does it meet the qualifications? Okay. So there's two phases that we need to do this. One is the 40K, it's the Imperium Fascist, but more importantly, what is fascism? Well, here's the problem. That conversation really never was honestly answered. And to give you any kind of particular context, usually this is the problem that we have, particularly in the modern social discourse. When you hear, oh, well, this thing's fascist, or this thing isn't fascist, or what have you. Either the definition of fascism is so very uniquely precise for people that it only encompasses, like, fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini, and you actually don't even encompass Nazism. Nazism is its own thing under Nazi Germany, and then you have almost all the Axis powers don't qualify as fascist. That, or it's something so more superfluous and so more open that you can have everything from Imperial Japan, which isn't too terribly far away from what Italy and Germany were doing, but you also very rapidly can put the Soviet Union under that regard. And almost no one wants to agree under any definition that the Soviet Union was fascist. So what do? Do you have it something so limited that literally only Nazi Germany and fascist Italy go with? Or is it something where it's a lot more superfluous that goes across the board where you can put a lot more people and a lot more institutions under that guise? I tend to lean more with the latter, that it's something that's a lot more open, and I'm going to piss a lot of people off here, but to some degree, like my personal definition of that would almost makes the Soviet Union a fascist state, and it definitely makes modern China a fascist state. And so let's address what that actually is, what that means, and why I feel the way I do, and then 40K, and we'll address the Imperium and Man, 40K. Actually, I'll talk about 30K as well, whether it is. Okay, method number one. What are we talking about here? One, it's anti-liberal. Fascism was largely built out as a response against liberalism. They thought the idea of dividing the political plurality of people was actually a terrible idea because it made compromises and it made all these different organizations that did not embody the institution. And the big thing about metric number two, or more, I'll have to put this as metric number one, the anti-liberalism metric number two, is a rugged sense of institutionalism. I'm going to write these down just so I can say consistent. And that is, the institutions are the more important part than a person's individual liberty and individual freedom. They absolutely reject liberalism in that regard. Now, a lot of that is built off political corporatism, and that is largely something that we find in a lot of different political alignments. So that's not specific to fascism in any way regard. What it is getting onto is that who the political corporation is built upon, and that is an ethnocentric group. More specifically. Now, this is actually one of the big things that Nazism and fascism doesn't agree with. If you look at like Benito Mussolini's Italy versus Nazi Germany, is that Italy and Japan have something very in common in that they largely believe in a more nationalistic sense versus Nazi Germany was more of an ethnocentric sense. And actually, you could probably overlap Nazi Germany and Italy a little bit more into that versus Italy, because Italy had minorities that some of them they liked, some of them they didn't. And if anyone wants to get into that, we can. But I'll put it this way. One of the main themes is that the political corporatism is built around particularly either a nation or an ethnicity to a large degree. That is the body politic, and if you're not part of that institution, you cannot be a formal operative member, and you are an enemy or an outsider or an effector, what have you. And so either rugged nationalism or rugged extreme ethno-nationalism or nationalism to a large degree is definitely one of the major characteristics. So we have two. A massive sense in institutionalism, that is the institution is the strongest, and that is reflected in part in the ethno-national part, or is that is reflected in the ethno-nationalism. The next thing is, everyone likes to talk about the economic ideas of fascists. They don't understand what that actually is. The economic principles of fascism is they don't give a shit. They honestly don't. A lot of people are like, oh, they're pro-capitalist, oh, they're pro-socialist, oh, they're pro-this. Okay, in theory, in actual like methodology, fascism evolved as a right-wing version of socialism. But what the difference between right-wingers almost across the board and left-wingers across the board for most of human history, and particularly our modern politics, is that right-wingers tend to view things in a more social aspect, and left-wingers tend to view things more in an economic aspect. And I'm not getting into the principles of like soc dems and dim socs and whatnot. What I'm getting is this. The political health of a society for right-wingers usually tends to be more social-based, in that there are social norms and cues that you have to follow in with to be a proper member of that society. And so, if it's more of a Christian-centered thing, you have to go to mass, you have to go to, take your communion, all that stuff. And of course, I'm talking Catholic, pardon me. But you have to follow through with the tenets of what is outlined for you. The left, more particularly in the last 150 years, has focused more on the economic front, and that is to be a fully operational member of the citizenry is that you have to have the economic tools to participate. And this is the big difference between the fascist states in the Soviet Union, is that the right on a methodological level were socially conservative, and that you have to maintain a specific ordered principle in how society should run to become full and active members of the society. Now, there's a bit of horseshoe theory here when it comes to the Soviets, but here's the real difference between them. The Soviets believed fundamentally, and this is where like Stalin and Lenin fuck it all up, is that economically everyone has a right and a will and a dignity to being treated as a full citizen, and they need to have the minimum outcome and the minimum basically the minimum prosperity to be full citizens. And the entire state apparatus was originally geared to enhance that and enact that, is that everyone gets at least a bottom floor that they have to get to be fully realized productive members of the society. And so I'm going to put down as my third criteria what's the word I want to use here? Not a social credit system. What's the word here? Like a social hierarchy. Not the word I want to use either. Somebody help me out in chat if you would. We're talking about a social litmus test. Largely a social doctrine. Yeah. I want to do that. We're looking for a social doctrine that largely interprets the physical health of the body politic being relayed in how people operate and behave. So social behavioral doctrine is what I'll label this as. So, recap. Rugged institutionalism, largely based in an ethno-nationalism or a hyper-nationalism that has a social behavioral doctrine that it largely enforces. That is its prime tenets. That's largely originally the three cornerstones, the trifecta for me. Now, you can add a few other things on here, rugged militarism and all this other stuff. To some degree, I think that largely goes with the ethnocentrism to some degree. But if you want a social caste system, it doesn't get that bad. At least I would take issues with that. What it largely gets into, for me personally, is that socially, it's that you have Nazis didn't have a problem with being meritocrat. If you could perform, you would got promoted. And you definitely see this within the Wehrmacht. What you do have a problem with is that if you aren't playing the rules, you get ostracized pretty quickly. No, it's not a social contract. But anyway, I thank you guys for helping on that one. The other thing here is that I'm going to probably just add on is like a hyper-militarism and a hyper-expansive an expansionist hyper-militarism. And this is actually one of the big differences between, again, the Soviet Union and the more fascist states is that we're talking about a imperial expansionism or a militaristic imperial expansionism, and that is a military effort to conquer, subjugate the people that are not part of their coalition group and force their geopolitical, or in this case it will be astropolitical, advantages and thoughts onto others. This is something that the Soviets really don't do. While they will ride out post-World War II, the Soviets, largely believe that is a domestic thing, and while they'll happily get involved in espionage to affect that, Soviets very rarely invaded anybody who didn't conform to their narrative unless they were already technically part of it. So Czechoslovakia, Poland were already puppet states, they invaded them. And whenever you talk about like the invasion of Finland during the Continuation War or the Winter War, they don't go for the knockout blow and just formally annex Finland. They took the strategic areas. What we saw consistently from the Soviets was the revolution needed to be brought to you, but it had to be your own peoples to do that, or with help from the Soviets. But you had to sign on to it. And the only reason why they control Eastern Europe is not because they invaded Eastern Europe and took it over forcefully, as in they had to, that they wanted to, but they had to. Is that it was a response to basically the Axis declaring war on them, and basically everyone in Eastern Europe either had been subjugated by the Third Reich or by Italy, or had joined their alliance. And so they basically had to reassert an order because it declared war on them. So anyway, without further ado, is that, imperial militaristic expansion. So we have 4 criteria, right? Institutionalism, or rugged institutionalism. The institution is more important than you, and that is largely an anti-liberal policy. We have ethno-nationalism or hyper-nationalism. We have a social behavioral doctrine, and we have a militaristic imperial expansion. Okay, cool. How does the Imperium of Man rank up in this? Well, I'm going to divide this into a conversation because I think one form of the Imperium is way more fascistic than the other form of the Imperium. All right. The 41st millennium, or even the 42nd millennium under Goleman. Goleman's a little bit of a change up and actually gets it a little bit more fascistic, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, the Imperium of Man that we're all used to all the way up until the more recent storyline is that it's not, for me, a fascist state. It leans into it. It's got a lot of commonalities, but it's more of a theocracy and more of a hands-off thing. So let me go down the list real quick, and I'll talk about whether it meets or does not meet the qualifications. Rugged institutionalism. To some degree, yes, but into a large degree, no. And people have talked about this a lot, is that could the Imperium police all these worlds, basically enforcing their doctrine onto them? Well, the answer is yes. There's this big conversation that, you're talking about an Imperium of over 1 million worlds, right? How are you going to administrate all this? Humans are pretty good at administration sometimes, right? We screw it up, but in a general sense here, is that the difference between a fascist imperium would be more of a direct rulership where you have a lot more of extensive institutional oversight into how you operate, versus the Imperium of Man is largely a tributary empire. They have a very limited social contract that each planet has to abide by, and outside of that, if it's not on the contract, you don't have to worry about it. So you could be a monarchy, you can be a republic, you can be an open, full-fledged democracy, a full democracy. You can be basically almost an anarchist state. Anything under the sun, largely an imperial world can be, as long as you pay up to the empire. And you have to do largely 2 things. One, you have to pay your imperial tithes. Whether it be they small or large, is that you have to give out manpower, or you have to give out your taxes to the empire so that they can largely, one, assert their power, their astropolitical power, but also defend you or support you in the event that it needs to happen. And that's basically how these kind of empires work, is that at least in a sense, what the empire is a tributary federation. They force it on you, but they don't openly tell you how to behave. And that's something that fascists would never appreciate or tolerate, is that it would be far more of direct rulership. Everyone has to have the same legitimized form of government, and it would be it would be a lot more structured and hierarchical. This is your administrator on this level, then this level, then this level, then this level, and this level, and it gets all the way up until you get the High Lords of Terria and the Core 12. That is not what we see here. And usually even the Higher Lords of Terria would be something that fascists would frown on. They like unitary single-person rule, and that's only the real difference between like Germany and Japan to a large degree, is they had more of a military junta. And so I don't think institutionally, while there is some alignment there, that they qualify for this one. So I'm going to put at least either a net neutral or just a blatant X here. Let's go into ethno-nationalism. Yes, although they're a little bit light-handed on it. Largely, this is a carrying call for the Imperium to go forward. And so I'm going to check the box this one and say that this definitely is still a thing, because a lot of the imperial doctrine is the Xenos are filthy scum. On the other side of that, though, is that there's a lot of imperial worlds that will still deal with aliens and trade with them and what have you. Largely, most of them have been wiped out, but for the limited interactions that there's a lot of people that don't really believe in that. But I'm going to say that at least by doctrine, the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium still has that to a large degree. Humans are the master race. Humans are basically the reason the universe exists. And everybody else should be put under heel and under boot. That's largely the case, and some of these newer storylines screw it up, particularly in the revival of our good friend Golem in here, is that you had like Eldar show up on Macragge, and they weren't shot on sight. So there's a level of this to where it functionally kind of breaks down, and so I'm going to say yes, but it has an asterisk on it. Next is a social doctrine or behavior. Absolutely, this is the case, although it's also incredibly not the case. There is a imperial organization that is the imperial cult or the imperial truth, and that is that the emperor is the god of mankind and that you should be worshipped. But it doesn't say anything about a standardized doctrinal practice of how that should be done. And so you can worship, the emperor could be a sun god, he could be a planetary god, he could be a god of volcano. As long as you worship the emperor, the empire doesn't give a flying shit. And we've literally seen Imperial Guard regiments fight each other over their differences because they believe in a completely different theological statement than the others do. And so I'm actually going to put this as an X to a large degree, that they don't qualify for this because it's not a rigorous social doctrine that is enforced upon everybody. It's very, I'm not going to say libertarian, but it's very hands-off, is that you have to abide by one creed and content, and outside of that, they don't give a shit. So largely, there's an ethnocentric creed as a social manner, and then there's also a religious manner there. They do align to some degree, but mostly, no, they don't. They just don't. And so the social doctrine, it's nowhere near as rich as what we would expect in a fascist state or a social or that kind of state. Or Nazi fascist state. Pardon me, I can't talk to that. So I'm going to say no to this one. It's not nearly that rigorous, and it's not that unitary, and that is something that fascists would absolutely despise and hate. You're not going to have German troops or Italian troops or anyone fighting over what their major differences are on the battlefield because of major differences. That would not be allowed, in the sense that it would be forced on everybody. You believe this, and if you don't believe that, you're getting kicked out. That being said, the fascists didn't have a huge emphasis on religion anyway. In fact, Germany kind of rewrote what their national religion was, and it was really weird. It didn't really agree with any significant Christian, even central Christian viewpoints. I can't think what I'm talking about here. I'm sorry. Even central Christian theses, or theses, whatever it is, they didn't agree with them. And they openly rewrote them. But I'm going to table that for a later day. That's a whole other thing. The last thing, a militarist imperial expansion. And basically, instead of like letting everybody just do their own thing, is that they openly seek to conquer and take over. Of the empire of the 41st millennium, this is actually not the case. this is a empire that is largely trying to defend itself, and while there will be a crusade every now and again to bring new people into the fold, that is definitely not the norm. Most of the imperial planets are not built to propagate war and defend, or I'm sorry, not defend, but to openly attack and expand the reach of the empire. It's actually largely more as a defensive measure, and what we've definitely seen is that there's a lot of worlds in the empire that are not even on a war footing. And basically every time the Tyranids attack or what have you, or if you have like an orc invasion, you'll actually see planets start mobilizing for a war in a way that the fascists would approve of, but they do not operate on that level as a normal institution. The universe or the Imperium is not on a consistent war footing where every planet has to be mobilized and fully committed to a war effort to expelling the Xenos and destroying them. That's not the case. And so I'm going to hit a big fat X. And so only one of these, I firmly believe, the Imperium of Man of the 41st Millennium qualifies for. And so I'm going to say that in a general sense, the Imperium of Man of the 41st Millennium is not fascist. Okay, cool. A lot of you have been really quiet in chat, so hopefully you guys are enjoying this, but I don't see you guys typing, but obviously I'm not really engaging that. Here's the thing I want to talk about before I close this out. The Imperium of the 30th Millennium, under the Emperor and under the Primarchs, is a fascist state, and pretty much meets each and every one of these to a completely different level. Okay, let me hit the institutionalism. Everything, the Emperor is a formally unitary body that everyone is behind, and then the Primarchs are basically its hands and its agents, and every world of the Empire is not a tributary system. You bend to the Imperial knee, and once you are part of the as an Imperial possession, Imperial world, you are governed like every other world as part of the possessions. There might be some minute details that you get away with that other other planets do not, but it is far more institutionally rigorous and imposed and normalized in how they operate. And to that degree, absolute fat check mark. Next, ethno-nationalism or nationalism. Absolutely. Literally, the entire point of the Great Crusade and the Imperium of Man during this period is that that the universe needs to be united under the human banner, and they are fully arbitrated and mobilized to do that. And so, ethno-nationalism, hard check. And we'll jump to the militaristic imperial expansion because we just kind of talked about that anyway. Yeah, all of these worlds are geared for war. Once you're brought in, there's no peace to be obtained. There's no redirecting towards like, oh, no, we can take a collective breath. As soon as you're annexed, your resources are now no longer used for the war effort for opposing the Imperium. You're now part of the Imperium, and your war effort is to bringing other worlds into the Imperium. And you are fully mobilized as an Imperial entity into expanding the Great Crusade. And so 100% it checks that box. The last one is a strict social doctrine of behavior, or strict behavioral social doctrine. They don't have the imperial cult to where they worship the emperor, but they have something very much like it, and that is actually a rigid atheism, that there is no gods. Humanities are unto gods themselves, and this is a little bit of a loose translation. There isn't any gods. Humanity should believe in themselves. The emperor is just a man. But the real important thing here, at least for the Imperium, is that there is an explicitly strict social doctrine. 1, there is no gods, there is no religion. Number 2 is that you will obey the imperial, you'll basically obey the imperial creed or the imperial oaths. That is, you obey the institution. You will, become part of the military. You'll become part of the war machine. You will help expand the empire in a very specific way. And while it's not openly talked about exactly what the rules are under that guide, I think that's something that's a lot more for the Horus Heresy series that is only really, they've got quite a few books out, but I haven't got to read a lot of them. I think that's been expanded on what those rules are, but we definitely seen with like Malkador the Sigillite, we've seen with the Emperor, the Primarchs, everyone has the rules of what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to behave. Check mark for this as well. And so, I'm going to wrap this all up and say the following as a recap. The Imperium of Man in the 41st Millennium, by the definition that I have set out, is not a fascist state. It leans into it to some degree, but it's a lot more open-minded, anti-institutional than most fascists would be okay with. The ethno-nationalism is still largely on point by doctrine, just not in practice, but the doctrine is more important than the practice to some degree. Social behavioral doctrine, very close, very close in that sometimes it meets up with it, but it's nowhere near as rigorous as most fascists would actually appreciate or respect. Is that it's way too open-handed about it, in that you can have these guys worship the emperor as the sun god, and these people respected as the great liberator of a millennia ago, or what have you. Fascists would not appreciate this or accept it. Now the final part is militaristic expansion. No, they're not on that level of war footing. They've actually tried to bring a relative era of peace for the Imperium, because while they'll go on crusade, they're more of on a defensive stance, and their martial abilities are not towards expanding the empire nearly as much as it is maintaining the status quo. And again, the 30th, 31st Imperium absolutely is fascist. It hits all those knocks on a drop, or it hits all those on a drop. I need to speak. I can't talk. I'm sorry. I need water. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the Imperium in a nutshell. Is it fascist? 41st millennium? No. 31st millennium? Yes. And with that, I've been Tyberius D. I hope you guys enjoyed this particular thing. And if you guys have any questions on my thoughts on the 40K, be sure to check out the 40K like backdrop as to what that world is, what it means. Should have dropped on YouTube the day before this recording, or the day before this video is released. So that should be available. And if you have any other further thoughts, you want to ask me what my thoughts are on the Tau or the orcs or what have you, or any other thoughts, feel free. LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube comments, all those things are available to you. Feel free to contact me. Let me know what you want to know. There's plenty of questions. That's how we got to this episode, is people said, hey, I want you to talk about 40K. So that option is available to you. I hope you guys enjoy it. Without further ado, I have lost my voice. Enjoy the outro. The stream is not over, but this recording certainly is. We'll catch you next time.